Hello and welcome to Speaking Spirit, where we talk about all things spiritual. Your host, John Moore, is a shamanic practitioner and spiritual teacher. And now, here's John.
Hello, everybody. This is my second podcast. If you have not listened to my inaugural podcast, the first episode, I talked about how dark and light on a spiritual perspective are two sides of the same coin. And today I'm headed straight down that duality pathway again. We're going to talk about divine masculine, divine feminine. It's interesting. We aim for non-duality in spirituality, but it's useful, I think, to think of the way that the universe is abundant and diverse, and the way that spirit expresses itself in all its very many ways. But it's all part of one. Divinity is one thing, and we're all a part of that, and that's the beautiful thing. And today I'm going to talk about divine masculine and divine feminine and how that can be sometimes a sticky topic, particularly when we get to talking about gender and how we represent gender spiritually. There is the principle of gender in, I'm just going to pull this up so I can read the exact quote here. So the Emerald Tablet, if you're not familiar, this is a pretty ancient piece of writing. We have no idea where it originates. There's lots of legends about it originating before ancient Egypt and showing up in all kinds of different cultures. Whatever the truth of the history of this document, we call it an Emerald Tablet because originally it was supposed to be inscribed into a green stone tablet. It has had an effect on spirituality, particularly in the Western world, for millennia. Like, it's been around for a very, very long time. You see it showing up in Greek. You see it showing up in, the thoughts that get filtered through Western religion. So, regardless of its, of its history, of its actual history, which is frankly probably lost, we don't really know. It's had a real effect, and it is a foundation of Western spirituality. It's attributed to somebody called Hermes Trismegistus, which means, Hermes the thrice great, also known as Thoth. Thoth being associated with the Egyptian god of writing and knowledge and that sort of thing. There's lots and lots of legendary stuff about different incarnations and that sort of thing. Again, regardless of its actual history, you can't deny that it has a profound effect on Western spirituality, Western thoughts. There are whole systems of Hermetic spirituality that get filtered out. If you look at any of the sort of occult traditions or the secret society traditions, Freemasonry to the Golden Dawn, to any of those things, this Hermetic thought absolutely permeates that stuff. And if so I'm coming to you from the United States. If you know the history of the United States, a lot of our founding fathers were in fact Freemasons and filtered a lot of their belief systems into what we have, our form of government, everything from our form of government to the way that monuments were laid out in Washington, D.C., and all kinds of stuff like that. It's cool stuff. If you're really interested in alternate history, you can really go down the rabbit hole with that one. But from the Emerald Tablet, there are these 7 Hermetic principles, right? And so they're spoken sort of as truths, and I'm going to talk about this particular one, which is the principle of gender. And it states, and again, this is an English translation of who knows how many translations down the line. The English translation is gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. Okay, that's a pretty big statement. right? Saying that everything has its masculine and feminine principles. In the Western world, in the world that I grew up in, I grew up in a time where mostly, men were men, burly, the stereotypical, the stereotypical thing, boys wore blue, girls wore pink, that whole deal, right? This is where the idea of gender gets a little sticky, because there are all of these cultural overlays with what masculine and feminine means. And it's important to point out that, the tablet, this quote about masculine and feminine, is not necessarily about biological sex, although it does apply. And it's not necessarily about gender identity, although it does apply, right? We're now living in an age where gender identity is, accepted, that it's a little more fluid, that people don't necessarily comply with the gender they were assigned at birth. They don't necessarily identify with their chromosomal sex assignment, that sort of thing. And, obviously that bucks the system, that bucks the tradition. And there are a lot of, anytime you change the way society is, there is backlash. That being said, there are traditions all over the world for more than two genders. There, in some cultures, they recognize as many as 5 genders, and they recognize intersexual people and all of those things. This is not really about that. This is not really about those things. I just want to say personally, in my life, I want people to be who they are. I want people to be able to be comfortable, to be free to express themselves however they identify. And, to me, that's a beautiful thing. To me, diversity is wonderful. If you look around the universe, diversity is the rule, it's not the exception. If you look at the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the minerals, the elements, the stars, everything, we live in such a diverse universe. How could we not reflect that as human beings, right? How could we not accept and reflect that diversity is, it makes us stronger, for one thing. But again, we're going on to sort of divine masculine, divine feminine, right? So if this principle holds true that gender exists on every plane, there's a masculine and feminine on every plane, that would include what we consider sort of the divine plane, the unity. And it's interesting to think that the unity could be divided into two things, but the unity, the non-dual reality, you could call it God, you could call it the universe, you could call it the multiverse, you could call it the source, whatever your word for that is, that extends into everything. It is everything. It is everything that there is, right? And I want to give you some examples of how masculine and feminine show up in everything, but let's talk a little bit about what we mean by masculine and feminine. And it's a little weird, those words, some people are starting to replace those words when they're talking about spirituality because they get wrapped up in the whole politics of gender and sex and that sort of thing. But this is the tradition. This is how things have been described for thousands of years, the masculine and feminine principle. If you think about, sort of Eastern spirituality, Taoism in particular, you have yin and yang, or in and yo in Japanese. You have yin and yang, and the sort of the representation of that is the swirly symbol of dark and light, right? So again, going back to my last podcast where we talk about darkness and light being two sides of the same coin, the light side was seen as yang or masculine, and the dark side was seen as yin, or the female side, feminine side, not necessarily female, but feminine side. And there are principles associated with the ideas of masculine and feminine. The other thing I'll say is they cannot be separated. You can't have one without the other, right? You can't pull those principles apart in isolation. And so the masculine or yang side was seen as active, light, that sort of thing. So anything that's sort of active was seen as yang. And so the dark side was seen as passive or dark, right? And that's the yin side, the feminine side. This does not, language is hard because I'm not meaning to assign value to anything. There is nothing better or worse about active or passive. They are equally important. I'll give you an example of that from human life, right? We cannot, we're active during the day and we sleep at night. And if you think that being passive is not as important as being active, I don't recommend you try this. But if you've ever, I have twin daughters, and I think at one point I had gone without sleep for 3 or 4 days in a row when they were first born. I can tell you that being passive is critical. You cannot separate one from the other. You realize why they use, if you have children, particularly if you have multiples, you realize why they use sleep deprivation as a form of torture, right? You have to go through that. You have to go through the rest stage. It is so important. It is about renewal. It is about gathering. So gender, in this perspective, like it's weird to think of waking and sleep as gender, but this is really what the Emerald Tablet is talking about, right? The active principle. If we replace masculine and feminine with active and receptive or active and passive principles, it might make a little bit more sense. But traditionally, we've used masculine and feminine. And I'm going to talk about the divinity of that today as well. So just in human life, we have times of activity and we have times of passivity, and rest is as important, if not more, than activity. Anybody who has worked out, been a bodybuilder, tried to build up some muscle knows that the active part of your workout, right? When you go to the gym and you lift some weights, that's a stimulus for growth. But the actual growth, the actual time that your muscle grows is when you are resting. And if you don't get enough rest, if you go to the gym and you work out every day and don't give yourself enough time for recovery, you get injured. You don't get stronger, you get weaker, you get injured. And that's a truth. And that shows you why both parts are equally important. So I know I quoted him in the last podcast as well, but I think he's a brilliant dude. And, there's the Western philosopher, for lack of a better term for him, Ken Wilber. And he talks about the principles, the masculine and feminine principles of divinity as these sort of impulses. And I like that. I like these drives, and it makes a lot of sense to me the way he describes them. So the masculine divine principle, in this case, he calls Eros, right, which is a love principle. But the Eros impulse is the impulse for things to evolve, to be active, right? We go through evolutionary stages as a species. We go through evolutionary processes as an individual. Okay, so we started out as children and we grew up and we went to school and we bettered ourselves. And that impulse, that is part of the divine masculine. The divine masculine is to evolve back to divinity, is to become a greater holon, right? An individual package, as it were, right? And it's very individualistic in that respect. The divine masculine is somewhat individualistic. It's about sort of personal development and bettering oneself and that sort of thing. On the other hand, the divine feminine, he calls by the name Agape, which is another word for love, right? And this is about gathering, community building, pulling as you develop through the masculine, it's about pulling others up. And those principles acting together in any individual make for a much higher level of spiritual development. If you get either one of these things out of balance, and frankly, they're out of balance everywhere, right? And I will talk about that. If you get any of these principles, these gender principles, out of balance, you get lots of repercussions from that. A good example is when you get the masculine principle out of balance, you wind up with patriarchy, which we've been suffering under for, I don't know, thousands of years, right? You get this individualistic dominated culture, which is set up as a, very much as a hierarchy, right? You have your religious structures, your political structures, your even your community structures set up with one person on top and a couple of somewhat less powerful people under them, and then the majority of the people have no power, no say, no voice. We used to forbid people from learning Latin and require that all Bibles were written in Latin to keep people ignorant, and only the learned few, very, very wealthy people could access what was their only outlet for spirituality. Okay, so that's super out of whack, right? There's no movement. There's no movement for bringing people up. There's a movement for keeping people down, and it's about power over and not power with, and that is way out of balance. And we've been there for way too long. The pendulum is swinging back. We always move from individualistic to collective and then back again. And we've seen some minor movements that way. Obviously, the 60s were a big upheaval of that system, with the hippies and the peace movement and civil rights movement. And a lot of those movements were about that feminine principle of pulling others up, right? Again, out of whack sort of side of the feminine is, shows up in political systems like oppressive communistic regimes, right? Which are, again, they can have a patriarchal structure because they, definitely have people on top. But instead of pulling people up, they serve to push people down and make everybody the same, but make people, not get better. Like if you stand out from the crowd, you're going to be repressed. And so both sides are capable of a great deal of repression. Both sides are capable of a great deal of violence. And so that's not good. So either way, things are out of whack. So there is gender, there's passive and active and everything. And one of the great goals of divinity, the alchemical process of reaching our own divine spark, identifying more and more, my hopes, there's lots of different types of spiritual development, but my aim is always to more and more identify with the divine aspects of myself. And I hope that is true for other people as well, and take a really balanced approach to that. So you've got to balance those. You've got to balance those things out. You have to balance personal development with pulling other people up as well, with the Eros and the Agape, two sides of the same coin. So I want to talk. I want to talk about a TV show I've been watching, and I haven't read the books, but now I'm inspired to read the books. But there's a show that's available on HBO right now called His Dark Materials, and it's based on a book series by the same name. And you might have seen that or seen The Golden Compass, which is, I guess, one of the books in the series. But I'm prompted to go back and read the books from watching the series. I realized that that's probably the logical opposite way of doing things, but whatever works. And this isn't a really interesting piece of fiction. It is, in my opinion, pregnant with symbolism, with deep spiritual meaning. There's a lot of political stuff in there. It's obviously very entertaining, very well done. The acting is great. The way it's put together is great. What's important to me is that, if you're not familiar with the series, it takes place in this alternate universe where there is this patriarchal system that's ruling the government called the magisterium, which is a thinly veiled allegory to, when the church ran the government. They run things from a very patriarchal perspective, and their leaders are sort of priests and bishops, and they're all males and that sort of thing. Very, obviously similar to our own history. And in this universe, humans are, their soul, part of their soul anyway, takes the form of an animal. So this is different than a power animal. I'll explain how in a moment. But humans walk around with this animal companion, but it's part of their soul. If they die, the animal disappears. If the animal is killed, the person dies, and vice versa. So they're intimately connected. It bears noting that the animal, at least in the series I'm watching on TV, is normally the opposite gender of the human. Now, I haven't seen any transgender individuals in this show, so I don't know how, or if that shows up in the books at all, or how that works out. If it's if this is a principle, but it's just something that I noted. And it reminds me of this concept. There's this concept in Norse spirituality, Northern European spirituality, that shows up in Celtic spirituality as well. There's the idea of the fetch, which is this spirit that is part of, the Norse idea. There's this very complex, what they call soul complex, for lack of a better term. It's like your spirit, your soul is made up of all of these different identified pieces. One of those is, in English, we'd call it the fetch. In, I believe, ancient Norse, it's called the fylgia or fylgia, Fylgia. And the way that shows up in Norse spirituality is that it either takes the form of an animal, or it takes the form of a spirit that is the opposite gender of the person. In my understanding, and I'm certainly not an expert, but my understanding is that this is a spirit, an opposite gender spirit in Celtic beliefs that shows up when, if one sees it, one is about to die, or one is close to death, or one is in mortal danger, that sort of thing. Very shamanic, right? Because in shamanism, when you shift realities, you can start to see spirits. Like, there's this, we know scientifically there's this mental shift in brain states. Now we know because we have EEG equipment, but we didn't know thousands of years ago that if you had lots of theta brain waves, that you would be able to start to see spirits. We just knew that if you drummed or took certain plants or sang for really long periods of time or did certain dances, that would occur. But what's happening in all of these cultures is people are shifting their brains into a state where they are receptive. They're in a what we'd call a divine feminine state, receptive to impressions from the spirit world. So this concept exists, and I don't know for sure if the author, made that up out of the collective unconscious, if he used materials from other spiritual systems when he wrote his books or whatever. Be really interesting for me to dive into that at some point. I highly recommend the series. again, I haven't read the books, but I hear wonderful things about them from people that I know. So check it out if you get the chance. It's called His Dark Materials. So I believe that Carl Jung, Carl Jung was a Western. He represents the Western shamanic impulse, right? So the psychoanalyst who was contemporary of Freud's and then went off and did his own thing and is responsible for terms like complex, like psychological complex, and collective unconscious, and archetype, like becoming, defined the way they are and coming into popular ideation. And he definitely went through, if you read his life story and his autobiography, he definitely went through shamanic initiation. He was definitely experiencing shamanic states. He was channeling divine information when he came up with all of this thing. And it's important to recognize that the word psyche, which is the root of psychology, psychiatry, all of those things, to us it means mind. In the ancient Greek, the word psyche actually means spirit. So, when he talks about psychoanalysis, he's actually talking about analyzing the human spirit. But Carl Jung came up with this idea of animus and anima, which meant that, we have, and again, going back to these components of the human soul, we have parts, right? And you have experienced parts of yourself coming forward throughout your life. There are parts that might, for example, take over when you are angry. If you've ever done something and gone, gosh, that's not like me, right? It may be that there's this part that you're not in touch with that is, you're just not aware of, but it's a part of your psychological makeup, your soul makeup. And there's parts that he came up with that everybody has called animus and anima, right? Animus being the masculine and anima being the feminine, right? This is a part of you that is your opposite gender. It is, so all males have an anima and all females have an animus. So we all have that side to us. And so the interesting question is, what if you don't identify with your, the gender you were assigned at birth, or your biological gender, or you've changed genders, or that sort of thing. My take, and I am not an expert on animus or anima, is that this part of you takes on the opposite part that you identify with most closely psychologically. So I was born a male, I identify as male, I have an anima, which is a feminine part of my soul, a feminine aspect of my soul. If I believe this to be true, but if I identified as a female, even though I was born as a male and have the genetics of a male, I would probably have an animus, which is the masculine side. Because again, there's the principle that there is gender, that there's masculine and feminine in everything. It is not there is masculine or feminine in everything. And that is an important distinction. The principle is that there is masculine and feminine in everything. Now, what about people who are gender fluid or non-binary or don't identify with a particular gender? To be honest, I don't know. I would be very, very curious to find out. I would be more than curious to find out. I would be really happy to work with somebody who is gender fluid or non-binary to figure out what those parts of themselves are. Maybe it's complex. Maybe it's something unexpected. My guess is that there are parts that sometimes are more masculine, sometimes are more feminine. And again, this isn't about the cultural overlays of masculine and feminine. This isn't about boys wear blue, girls wear pink. This is about the soul parts of yourself, the parts. And again, we talk about parts of a whole, right? It's important to go back to the unity. It's important to go back to the divinity. Your divine self is one. It's inseparable. But then it sort of divides itself. So the one story is that God or the universe or everything or source, whatever name you want to call it by, wanted to, was everything there is and wanted to have certain experiences. And so the universe was created. And in that universe is all kinds of diversity. But first there was, basically there was nothing, and then there was the one thing, and that split into two things. This is from the Tao, and I'm paraphrasing because I do not have Lao Tzu memorized, but this is, the nothing became the one thing became two things. The two things became the 10, they say the 10,000 things. 10,000 is just a number that means like more things than you can count, right? Became everything. And the two things in this case are yin and yang, or these principles, these divine. This is when the driving principle of the universe, the divinity of the universe, split itself into active and passive so that it could create. Which brings me to creation, which brings me to manifestation, right? So and I realize in the animal kingdom there, and in the plant kingdom and in other kingdoms, there is the idea of asexual reproduction. And I'm not a biologist, so I could not divide that up necessarily into how that works on a masculine and feminine principle perspective. But there has to be that principle for creation to happen. Interesting to note, I read recently that funguses sometimes have up to 5 genders, and fungi, particularly mushrooms, do reproduce sexually. Even if you think of fungus as not multiple organisms, but they produce different types of spores and mycelium and that sort of thing that have different genders and interact with each other to create that genetic diversity. When you think about creation, you think about biological creation, at least on the animal kingdom level and the mammal level, we've got, the sperm and the egg coming together, the masculine and the feminine. The sperm being the active component, the feminine being the receptive component, right? We don't have to say passive, we can say receptive. And without that, you don't get life. You don't get, we need both components. So from a manifestation component, perspective, from a spiritual manifestation perspective, manifestation's a hot topic ever since The Secret came out however many years ago. You need both the active and the receptive component of manifestation to bring things about in the universe. How that takes place in your life, that's a topic for another day. That's a very big topic. Obviously, there's, you can probably, if you type manifestation into Amazon, you'll get a bazillion results. But you need both of those components. You need to have an active intention, and then you need to be receptive to what comes your way and actually be able to receive that for manifesting anything in the universe. Intention is a very masculine tool. So in shamanism, when we journey, so I journey using drum most of the time, sometimes rattle, but most of the time I journey using a drum, which means I go into an altered state and I do some work with helping spirits on behalf of myself or other people or the community, or I go there to travel in non-ordinary reality to gather information or get healing, that sort of thing. So the intention, you always journey with an intention, right? I'm going to meet with my helping spirits to do X, Y, Z. That's masculine principle. That's a masculine principle of spirit. But then I have to become, once I have that intention set, I have to become receptive. I have to be able to enter into the trance state using the drum or whatever method you use to enter trance state. Some people dance, people take plant medicine. Whatever your method is, you have to be receptive to that, or it's not going to be effective. So you have to embody both masculine and feminine principles in your spirituality. And so that, spiritual work takes place is much more effective when you embrace both sides, when you embrace the active and the receptive, the masculine and the feminine. It's super, super important. One last thing I'll talk about before I leave you this time is, so I sit with a lot of shamanic circles. I have taught numerous classes. I have taken years and years and years of training. And in my experience, I am frequently either the only man in the room or one of very few. I think the most number, so, let's say I went and I took a class. I went and took a class on, teaching shamanic journey to others years ago. I think there were 2 other men in that class of about 24 people. And that was the highest ratio I've ever experienced in any class I've taught, any training I've given, any class I've taken. That's been the highest ratio. So there's this sort of mystery to me that I'm plumbing the depths of why more men don't get involved in this type of work. And it's not just shamanic work, any type of spiritual work. When I do, I used to, before pre-pandemic, I used to hold meetups for what we called spiritually conscious professionals, which were people out in the world who were practicing any form of spirituality and wanted to come have conversations with like-minded people. And, frequently maybe one man out of 10 or 12 or 16 or 20 people would show up to these meetings. So I don't think it's just shamanism. I think it's lots of forms of non-traditional, non-Western, non-church spirituality. There are very, very few men doing this work. I understand part of it, but part of it is a mystery to me, and it's tough because it's a little unbalanced. I would love to see more men do this work. I think it is important. My take, and I'm not 100% sure, my take on why more men don't do this work is, it's a cultural thing. We do not train men through particularly culture in the U.S., the Western culture that is prevalent in the U.S., and I realize the U.S. is a very multicultural place. But there's still this cultural force in the U.S. that men don't do this kind of thing, right? And for lots of different reasons. Shamanism is also going to put you in touch with some really deep feelings. And again, there's this cultural thing where it's not acceptable. It's changing. Thank goodness for that. Where it's not acceptable for men to have deep feelings of grief or sadness or love, or this agape feeling of love of community where you pull everybody up. That's one aspect. That culture pushing that thing down. And gosh, any sort of shamanic initiation, shamanic training is going to make you confront that stuff. It's going to pull it up. I have cried in circle, ugly tears. I have ugly cried in circle, and I got to tell you, I'm a fairly sensitive, emotionally vulnerable man, and that is super uncomfortable for me. Where I have to confront that in myself. I have to say, why is that uncomfortable for me? Why is that not okay? Why is it okay if a woman I'm sitting in circle with, like, touches some deep trauma in her life and, cries about it and everybody's comforting her, but I feel uncomfortable if that happens to me. That's work I need to do. And wow, what a treasure that is to discover that. What a treasure for me to discover the way the cultural forces have made me push stuff into my shadow and start to confront that stuff. So I do wish more men would become involved with this work. The other side of that coin, right? The other aspect that I see happening is that shamanic practice in particular, and lots of alternate forms of spirituality, are non-patriarchal, right? We do not have a hierarchy. We do not have authority. I mean, we have, by authority, people who have authority are people who've practiced for a long time and are elders that we go to for wisdom. But there's not a structure. There's no pope and bishops and cardinals and that sort of thing, right? It is not pyramid shaped. It is circular. And I honestly think that, at least on a subconscious level, a lot of men are uncomfortable with that. There is pressure. You think about the phenomena of mansplaining, right? There's a phenomena, the alpha male concept, where men feel pressure to be the smartest person in the room, the most powerful person in the room, to stand out in some way. And, when you sit in circle, you have to set that aside. And I think that can be uncomfortable for a lot of men. You approach everybody, including spirit, as equals. And so that is, that gets away from that pyramid structure, that hierarchy, that patriarchal structure. And I think it's so ingrained. It's so ingrained in everything we do. You look at the way we set up companies. You look at the way we have schools with principals and vice principals and department heads and teachers and all those things. You look at universities where we have, presidents of universities, and then we have boards of directors, and we have deans, and we have tenured professors, and we have, almost every cultural structure we have is a pyramid. And, shamanism and some of these alternate forms of spirituality, and when I mean alternate, I just mean historically not the dominant spiritual culture. I don't take shamanism as alternate to anything. It is my way of being spiritual. I just mean it hasn't been the dominant paradigm in the culture I live in for my lifetime, and for many generations back. Okay, so I don't mean I don't mean to denigrate anybody's form of spirituality. I'm just trying to point out things that I'm experiencing. Okay, if you are happy in a patriarchal religious structure, then power to you. And that if that empowers you and you are not disempowering anybody else, then fantastic. That's absolutely great. Where we get into trouble is where you feel the need to disempower others. And that is not a place of power. That's actually a place of fear. It's a place of weakness. If you feel like you need to repress other people or oppress other people or put other people down or look at them as less than and not equal to, that's where we're going to run into some problems. And that, again, that's a place of fear, not power. Okay. And so, again, onto the sort of divine masculine, divine feminine, the divine masculine being these Eros, this ability to pick oneself up as a unit and develop and evolve and become closer to spirit and identify more with the undying divine spirit that is the spark inside you at the core of your being, and the spirit of agape, which is this love, this collective, I'm divine, you're divine, let's bring everybody together. Those things working in tandem are pretty unstoppable. It's pretty amazing. Is it a challenge to balance those things in your life? Absolutely, 100%. That if everybody had that perfect, we would all be enlightened beings, I guess, or something along those lines. It is always, to me, my spirituality, my spiritual development is always a work in progress. I don't believe I'll ever say that I'm done. Not in this lifetime, certainly. Maybe not in 10,000 lifetimes. I don't know. But I actually like that. I actually like that I'm a work in progress, right? Because I do not float on clouds. I do not ride a unicorn to go to circle any of those things. I am, the inside of me, the divine part of me is as perfect as everyone else, which is absolutely perfect, whole, complete, and unbroken. And the human parts of me are just as flawed, broken mess as anybody else. And so how could I identify with anyone? How could I be on that level of agape if I can't get down in the muck with anyone that I'm working with anyone that I'm helping? If I can't talk about my trauma, my pain, my wounds, that sort of thing. So with that, I'm going to bring this podcast to an end. I hope that you'll subscribe and listen as I move on in the future. As I stated in my first episode, my hope is that this will expand, that in the future I will interview other people, so I'm not just listening to the sound of my voice, and you're not just listening to the sound of my voice, but that I will bring in other perspectives with people with more and different knowledge than I have, and that sort of thing. And I hope to grow, my real hope is to grow a community out of this, podcast and the other things that I'm doing. I will say, and here's the pitch, I guess, if there is a pitch here. I hope you will subscribe. B, coming up in March of 2021, I will be doing a first. I will be, first of all, teaching an intro to shamanic journeying class online. I have taught probably dozens of those in person, but because of the pandemic, that's just not possible. It's not possible to sit in a room with 20 people drumming and journaling safely at this point. I hope it's something I absolutely love doing, so I hope to restore that once the pandemic is under control. So I will be in March. I will be teaching over a weekend, a 2-day online intro to shamanic journeying class. If it's something you've ever wanted to learn, the second part of that's new for me is I will be teaching with 3 other amazing shamanic teachers. It's a fantastic opportunity for me to experience other people's teaching styles, how they interact with students, and I think it's a great opportunity for anybody who takes the class to get 4 different perspectives, and the learning really kind of goes in that way. So you can get more information about this course. There's a banner at the top of my website. If you click on it, it will take you to info about the class, which has registration and everything. And I am at Maine Shaman, MaineShaman.com. That's mainshaman.com. And if you just want to go find more information about me, read articles, look at other episodes of this podcast, you can go there as well. I do have a link to the podcast at the top, which should have every episode. This is episode number 2, so if you're interested in listening to episode number 1, you can go there or find me on everywhere where you find podcasts. I hope that you're having a fantastic new year. I hope to see the end of this pandemic soon. It's my my intention. I know that every shamanic practitioner I've talked to sees this whole global pandemic as an opening to initiate. It's a call to shamanic initiation, and I don't just mean like everybody needs to start studying shamanism. It is a call. It's a crisis. It's a call to do inner development for the entire planet. And if some good can come out of this, that might be a part of it. It might be a part of while recognizing the lives lost, the lives interrupted, the effect on the world in general is pretty horrific when you look at it. If we can get good out of this, it's about how we can pull together, how we can individually develop, how we can be stronger apart and together, that sort of thing. So with that, I will leave you, and I will hope that you will continue to join me in the future.
You have been listening to Speaking Spirit with your host, John Moore. For more info or to contact John, go to mainshaman.com. That's maineshaman.com.